Good morning, everyone. Let me welcome to this webinar. Who's speaking is Francesco Bosello. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Milan at the Department of Environmental Sciences and Policy. I'm also Senior Researcher at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. And finally, I'm the coordinator of the COACCH project. Welcome to this webinar, which belongs to the series of CMCC webinars, and in particular is the opening of the first out of 4 webinars related to the results produced by this COACCH project. So let me welcome. I'm very glad to see how many participants are interested in this topic. And this is encouraging also in these times of, let's say, troubles and health emergency. I think that is important to have an environmental and climate change awareness still high. So, 2 words really about the COACCH project. This is an Horizon 2020 research project lasting 3 years and a half. It is more or less 2 years old. And now we are able to produce the first research results from this project. The major focus and the novelty of COACCH is to improve the knowledge about and the economic quantification of climate change impacts with a focus on regional asymmetries induced by climate change impacts. This is one issue. The other novelty of the project is trying to understand which are so-called tipping points, social economic tipping points, so situation of particularly huge and non-linear damages affecting social economic systems against trying to identify, especially in Europe, where these tipping points or hotspots are. So, before giving the floor to the chairman of this webinar and also to the speaker, of course, let me also very briefly say 2 words about the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. It is a multidisciplinary research center based in Italy with the main aim to study climate change impacts and also solutions, so therefore policies, trying to put this in the broader context of sustainability and sustainable development in order to give support to policymaking, of course advancing research and also supporting private action. CNCC is a multidisciplinary research center and also multi-office research center, so it's spread all over Italy, has been founded in 2005 and in 2015 has become a research foundation. It is actually composed by 7 members: the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, the University of Salento, the Italian Aerospace Center, Ca' Foscari University of Venice, the University of Tuscia, the University of Sassari, and the Politecnico of Milan. So it is a mix of research institution and academic institution. Is composed by 9 research divisions, 9 departments, each more or less composed by 20 to 30 researchers. And you can see how it encompasses all the different disciplines as much as possible that are related to climate change science, from climatology to social economic sciences, basically. And the research is organized across these 9 research topics that, as you see, tries to embed or nest the climate change issue in its broader relevance for societal development. In addition to research, CMCC is developing a lot of outreach activities. These webinars are just one of the initiatives in this direction, but in addition to scientific publication, we have also educational and communication activities that you are very welcome to investigate more on this, visiting our website. So let me just say that people who are participating to this webinar are very welcome to raise questions. And to do this, you have to write questions, and a moderator will select them and direct them to the relevant speakers, basically. Let me also say that the webinar will be recorded, so you could find it and revisit it afterwards in our website. And finally, very final point, let me say that as anticipated, this is just the first webinar related to COACCH research activity. The next one is already planned for May 14. So if you are happy with this one, you are very welcome to also apply and participate to the next one. Hopefully you will be as numerous as you are today, or even more. With this said, I finish my introductory speech, and I'm very glad to give the floor to Paul Watkins, which is the chairman and moderator of this webinar, and it is also part of the COACCH research team, and in particular is responsible for the huge stakeholder engagement that we developed within the project. So Paul, the floor is yours, and then just stop sharing the screen and mute my microphone as well.
Okay, thank you, Francesco. Good morning. Welcome to all our participants. This is the first webinar that we are produced on the COACCH project. So if there are any complications, we apologize in advance. What we have for you this morning is two really interesting presentations. So some really fascinating early results from the COACCH project, which is looking at the economic costs of climate change in Europe. And the way that we would like to run this is we will have one presentation on agriculture and forestry and fisheries from Esther and Benjamin. And then we'll have a little bit of time for some quick questions after that. And then we'll go to a second presentation on coastal impacts from Daniel. And again, we'll have a few questions after that, and that will hopefully get us through the time about right. And then there'll be an opportunity after that for some extra questions if people want to extend for a little bit longer. Without that, and because we have a lot to get through, I'm going to pass across to Esther to kick us off with some really great results on the agricultural sector that we want to share with you. Okay, Esther, over to you, please.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Paul. So I will give you a brief overview of what we have been doing so far in the apologies in the agriculture, forestry and fisheries sector. And if okay, I have shared my screen now with you. This analysis has been done partly by EASA and partly by PIC. And I will focus here mostly on the results that have been taken place so far by EASA. Together conducted by myself as well as by Hugo Valin, who is in the audience here. So what do we? I'm very sorry. Okay, so sorry for that. What do we know about climate change and agriculture? Climate change has the potential to affect the agriculture, forestry and fisheries sector, both negatively from lower rainfall, increasing variability and extreme heats, as well as positively. So, for example, from increased CO2 fertilization and extended seasons. And this may result in impacts from gradual climate change and extreme events, but also in more indirect impacts, for example, due to pests and diseases. In turn, this may affect productivity and production, consumption, prices, trade, and land use. This climate research analysis has so far often been very sector specific, so focusing on one specific sector, for example, agriculture or the forestry sector, without using a more integrated approach, and it's also focused so far very often on long-term changes. In COACCH, we try to provide a consistent picture of the agriculture, forestry and fisheries sector, as well as mostly focusing on Europe and doing so at the spatially explicit NUTS2 level. So what we know from the literature so far is that there is a range of, or a scala of possibilities that influence the impact that the agriculture, forestry and fisheries sector will find of climate change. So on the left of the screen, you can find the uncertainty on future drivers, such as how much warming do we actually expect. For this, we have the RCP scenarios, such as they were developed in the IPCC 5th assessment report. These range from usually from RCP 2.6, which assumes a low level of warming, to 8.5, where the level of warming is very high. At the same time, there are questions about the future economy. So how much will there be demanded? What is the population growth and how sustainable will the future be? For this, we use the so-called socio-economic pathways, the SSPs. What is especially important also for the agricultural sector is the reaction to warming, so on plants. So the CO2 fertilization that is attached to these different RCPs will react differently for different plants, and this will in fact in turn impact their productivity and to the degree to which is quite uncertain. On the right of the screen, you can see the uncertainty in the modeling and the systems reaction. So there are different GCMs, global climate models, that all have different reactions of climate to temperature and, for example, precipitation. In order to give meaning to these uncertainties, we have developed a integrated assessment framework to analyze eventually the impacts on and the costs of climate change on the agriculture, forestry and fisheries sectors. For this, we start by using global general circulation models, GCMs. We try to use the best available data, so the Eurocodex data, where temperature and precipitation numbers feed into biophysical models. There are various biophysical models used, such as crop models, forestry models, and forest fire models, which in turn give the impact of productivity changes on bioeconomic models. Two bioeconomics models are used in this project, Globium EU and MAGPIE. These bioeconomic models are directly impacted by SSP and mitigation changes in order to give a range of the costs of climate change, as well as the area, consumption and land use change. I will now go through these results in terms of what you can expect from climate change, from the gradual climate change in terms of the biophysical part, the economic part, and the integrated part. For this, I will focus on the models we use at IASA, which is Globium and biophysical models, EPIC, G4M, and FLAM. Later on, my colleague from PIC, Benjamin Boderski, will also give some introduction into MAGPIE. For the biophysical impact, we have seen, we can see that we have used the model, the process-based biophysical model EPIC, to assess the main global agricultural systems in response to management interventions. So this can be irrigation or, for example, fertilizer change under a changing environment, which is in this case different degrees of climate change. The four figures below here show the impact of climate change on wheat and corn for different levels of warming. So in this case, on the left for an RCP 4.5 and an RCP 8.5 scenario. Two striking features here are that the impacts on wheat are far less significant than the impacts on corn. This has to do with the fact that wheat is a C3 crop, which adapts better to CO2 fertilization, as we call it, so the degree of warming, and corn is a so-called C4 crop. If we turn to RCP 8.5, we can see that the effects are becoming more negative, especially in the south, but that this line keeps going up to the north as well. With regard to forestry, we use the global forest model G4M to assess the change in biomass accumulation. And this is based on radiation and temperature changes, and the forest growth, so the annual increment and the biomass are assessed. Here we can see that especially under HETCAM 8.5 scenarios, an RCP 8.5 scenario, especially towards a longer time horizon, impacts start to become negative in the southern part of Europe. Northern parts of Europe, especially in the Finland, in the short term, are having some positive gains through global warming. The second impact of forests, of climate change on forests, can be perceived through the enhanced risk of forest fires. For this, we use the wildfire climate impact model, the FLAM model, which uses the climate impact data as well as population population changes to see how the burned areas will enhance. Especially in European forests, and especially in Mediterranean European forests, these effects might triple by the end of the century, and then especially in the highest warming scenario in RCP 8.5. For fisheries, we use a range of RCP scenarios, RCP 2.6 and 8.5, and two fisheries production potential or catch potential models, the DFSFM model and the BDEM model, to assess the projected difference in change on catch potential. Especially here under the DBEM model, we can see that that in a high warming scenario in the tropics, where this has a large negative effect on catch potential, whereas in the northern hemisphere this might have a positive effect. So moving from these biophysical impacts towards more economic impacts, I will show you the effects on agriculture, forestry and fisheries separately of consumption, production and land use change, amongst others. For this, we used the partial equilibrium model GloBIOM, where the production changes feed into, so the climate-induced production changes feed into this model. This happens for the forestry sector, for the agricultural sector, and for the fishery sectors in an integrated way. In addition, we have the socio-economic scenarios that influence population, consumer preferences, and GDP. These come together at the level of the market. In this case, this is for Europe, the level of national countries at the country level. And this then influences the prices, which in turn influences demand and production, and drives land use change. From this, economic indicators such as costs, as well as environmental indicators such as biodiversity, can be calculated. In terms of the agricultural sector, we see that the economic impacts for agriculture are estimated in area, production, and consumption. Under CO2 fertilization, positive effects of climate change on wheat are observed. For corn, however, this is the other way around, and this has to do with the CO2 fertilization effects of the specific crops that I mentioned before. Generally, this effect holds along the axis of the different economic scenarios, whereas especially the SSP4 scenarios, or divided world, performs worse. However, we also find that the climate models have a huge impact in terms of the impacts on the economic situation that climate change enforces. Secondly, there are high regionally distributed effects. For example, for corn, we can see that the yellow bars here represent that in the south of Europe, the much larger losses are experienced than in the Central East or in the west of Europe. There is some adaptation in these models. For example, in the case of corn, we can see that area increases somewhat to compensate for the negative effect of climate change on the productivity of corn. However, this is not enough to compensate, especially in the high warming scenarios of RCP 8.5. If we move on to forestry, we can see that the biomass changes, we can analyze the biomass changes through the managed forest areas, as well as through the production and consumption of sawnwood and wood pulp. The largest effects are found for in terms of in a higher time zone, so in 2017 under RCP 8.5. Here, the managed forest area increases in Europe to compensate for the losses that we have seen in the biophysical models before. However, this is not enough to compensate for the loss of production of especially sawnwood and wood pulp. Again, here we would see highly differentiated impacts in terms of compared to a no climate change scenario, with especially losses in the western part of Europe. When we move to the fishery sectors, we can see that fisheries can that the economic effect of fisheries on Europe might not be as high as expected from what we have seen in the biophysical models. And one interesting finding here is that fish stocks can migrate, and due to this, they might actually move up and therefore have a not so negative effect on Europe as in other parts of the world. However, the fisheries sector is highly interconnected to the other sectors, to agriculture and forestry, through feed markets. So capture fisheries are therefore the primary source of fish meal and fish oil, which are ingredients for farmed fish, and therefore also not only the catch potential, but or the actually caught amount in oceans, but also the total amount of agriculture production decreases. As said, though, this effect is observed in Europe not as strongly as in the rest of the world. Although RCP 8.5 shows the strongest effects globally, we find that in Europe, also already with lower degrees of warming, this might already have a large impact in Europe, and that the degree of warming doesn't depend so much on the total losses perceived in Europe. Moving to the integrated impacts, one of the key assignments in COACCH is to quantify the costs of climate change. So we have done this for the agriculture, forestry and fisheries sectors separately as well as totally. For agriculture, we find a loss of in the middle of the road RCP scenario of RCP 4.5 of 1.3 billion euros. This is for livestock and crop production combined. For crop production alone, this would be around 600 million euros. On the forestry sector, we find around 870 million euros, and on the fisheries sector, this is around 600 million euros. One important finding, especially for the forestry sector, is that under RCP 8.5, fire protection efforts could triple and therefore add a significant costs of almost 4 billion euros in addition due to forest drying and high mortality of rates. For especially higher RCP scenarios, we also find a regional distribution effect where especially losses are observed in the southern part of Europe and in the central eastern part of Europe. These losses, though, may lead to environmental impacts, to reversed environmental impacts. This may mean that, for example, here in Spain, you can find a retraction of the area of cropland and forest land to the benefit of grassland and natural land. And this may mean that emissions, especially in these countries, can increase. So, can decrease, and therefore positive environmental impacts can be found. This is especially found in southern European countries, as well as in Finland, where the forest land is doing relatively better under a medium RCP scenario.
Esther, can you go to the conclusion soon, please?
Yes, so I'm here at the conclusion slide. So what do we find to bring this onto a conclusion is that for agriculture, the magnitude of climate-induced yield impact highly differs between either a C3 or a C4 crop. So, for example, between corn and wheat. So the biophysical impact is highly important. Largest losses are found in the southern and central eastern part of European countries. And in these areas, land reallocations are expected from the southern part to the northern parts of Europe. These findings are fairly robust towards different RCP and SSP scenarios, but this is less so for different GCMs and the effect of CO2 fertilization. For the forestry sector, we find a reduction in biomass, especially in high warming scenarios. This might be positive for some Northern European countries, such as Finland, but on this, the maybe largest threat for this forestry sector is the increase in burnt area that is expected, especially in the Mediterranean countries. For fisheries, we find a large decline in catches globally. However, because of the mobility of the fish stocks, this effect may be mitigated in Europe compared to other non-EU member states. So this is in a nutshell the results from the agriculture, forestry and fisheries sector. If you would like to further read into these results, they are described and they're uploaded in the deliverable 2.2 impacts on agriculture, forestry and fisheries on the COACCH website. Thank you very much. I would now hand over to Benjamin Bodirski for some reflection on this.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you see my screen? I hope
yes,
you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay. In my 5 minutes add-on to Esther's presentation, I actually don't want to go into further model results from MAGPIE, but I would rather share some general insights, some meta insights, and I would like to speak a bit about uncertainty, about the role of adaptation, and about also the difficulties in making agroeconomic or regional level agroeconomic projections. And let's first come to the role of uncertainty. As Esther showed, the results are the result of a whole model chain. So we have climate models combined with crop models, and then these crop models are combined with agroeconomic models of the agricultural sector, or in this case also even of forestry and agriculture and fishery. And within this model chain, of course, also the uncertainties add up. So we start off with, I would say pretty robust projections how much the global mean temperature rises with global warming. And then the first level where a lot of uncertainty comes in is when these global temperatures are then translated into regional patterns. So with the temperature, that's one thing. With the precipitation, that's even more difficult. So we have already a rather high uncertainty in the regional precipitation patterns for long-term projections. And then these temperature and precipitation patterns, they enter the crop yields, the crop models. And in the crop models, of course, we also have further uncertainties, for example, connected to the effect of CO2 fertilization that Esther already mentioned, but also to other things. For example, crop models so far are not very good at representing extreme events. They are not very good at representing the individual phenological states of the plant, and then if extreme events happen, for example, during a certain phase, like the emphasis of a plant where it flowers, this can have very strong impacts that are yet not possible to represent in global crop models. And then the next step is that these biophysical models enter the socioeconomic models. And you have to see that the climate change will not hit so much the current agriculture, but much more the future agriculture. So we actually have to look, or have to put it into a context of a world in the year, for example, in the year 2050, where of course economic growth has changed as well, population growth will have increased, and there are large uncertainties also concerning the policy conditions, trade agreements, etc. And then when you have such a global model, the last step to look at regional patterns is of course the most difficult, because here really in this global interconnected food system, really every world region competes with all other world regions for the most cost efficient production places. And these patterns are extremely difficult to project, as I will illustrate in a moment. And yeah, we focused a lot on this, on the role of adaptation within the system, and that happens at different stages. So first of all, you have some adaptation that happens after the harvest. So you can buffer bad harvests through storage. through regional pooling. That means if one part of Germany had bad harvests and another one good, these two cancel out. But also through global pooling, through international trade. You can substitute, you can also reduce the demand at the end if no other option is there. So feed demand, for example, is to a certain degree flexible to react. And then next to this post-harvest adaptation, you also have pre-harvest adaptation. So you can change the area, or you can also intensify the yield. This is, of course, something that you can only do when you anticipate the climate change impacts. And if you then, for example, in the next year, change your behavior accordingly. Yeah, and through this adaptation, we can clearly say that the biophysical outcome is not the final product, but it will be mostly reduced through adaptation. But this outcome after adaptation can be very different, and here really the relative competitiveness of the different regions is key. So, for example, if in one European region the biophysical impacts say that the yields go down, this does not necessarily mean that production actually has to go down. For example, it can be that in all other European regions the yields go down even further, so that the region which is the least affected will actually see increase in production because it has a relative competitive advantage. And the same is true for international markets. And finally, the same is also true within the same region. So for example, if, for example, crop yields of temperate cereals improve in Germany, but rapeseed yields improve even more, this could mean that temperate cereals are declining even though they had positive biophysical impacts. So you see that the dynamics are very complex, and it's also very difficult to project these yet. Just one example here, where you can see that they might be rather unintuitive. Here, for example, because of climate impacts, in this case, the climate impacts were positive due to CO2 fertilization. The positive impacts did actually get reinforced in Eastern European Union because it got so attractive for production that additionally to the positive impacts, we saw an area expansion and we saw further intensification of these areas because they were so competitive. While in other regions, it might be maybe the reverse, where basically because the positive yield effects, the area is reduced and rather given to a different crop. Coming to the conclusions, we really see very high uncertainties at this stage, and also a need to work further on this model chain. However, it's needed, of course, because we need to know what's in the end the economic effects. That the role of adaptation is really key, and in reducing the biophysical impacts, but also that we are not yet, or at least on the magpie side, we still have difficulties in representing this adaptation behavior well, and we assume that our assumptions are likely overly optimistic when it comes to the adaptation behavior. And finally, one finding that I clearly had was that that it's extremely difficult to make regional projections because relative competitiveness is so important and the global markets are so interconnected. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Esther and Benjamin. That was incredibly interesting. We have lots of questions, but what we are going to propose to do is to go straight to Daniel's talk to make sure that we do have the opportunity to get the content across in the first hour. And then if people who are interested can stay, we'll go through the questions and answer. So Daniel, can I ask you to take over and present your slides on the coastal sector, please?
Okay. Thank you. I was muted, but now I'm unmuted. Yeah, my name is Daniel Linke from Global Climate Forum in Berlin, and I'm working on impacts, climate change impacts in coastal areas, and I will present some results from COACCH on this, and I will try to hurry as we are a bit short in time. Yeah, coastal areas are places which are highly populated because it's nice to live there, and they also have a lot of economic activities. So it's worth to look at them. In my result presentation here, I will focus on the European results because COACCH is a European project, and the European Union has about 65,000 kilometers of coastline. We assess the following impacts within our assessments. It's coastal flooding, that's erosion of beaches and land, and wetland change. This is the loss or gain of things like marshes and globally also mangroves, but not in Europe. There are not much or not any mangroves in Europe. In addition, in COACCH for the first time, we looked at coastal migration as a effect of sea level rise and increased flooding, and we present the results on NUTS 2 level, which we also have not done before COACCH. And here, for assessing sea level rise impacts, we need to have sea level rise scenarios, and in addition to other sectors, we have another dimension of uncertainty when we look at sea level rise scenarios. Sea level rise scenarios do not only depend on the climate model and on the RCP, but also on assumptions on ice sheet melting. So there are basically two big land ice sheets, which is the Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet. And even if you fix your climate model and your RCP, there's huge uncertainty about how these ice sheets will react. We see this here, for instance, in the RCP 8.5, the Antarctica. There we have a lower bound, which is the 5% probability in a way of 2 centimeter, but the upper bound of 41 centimeters of sea level rise until 2100. And to capture this in the sea level rise scenarios, we just fixed one GCM, the Hadley Center GCM, the first one in line, and we interpret the low and high climate uncertainty more as these uncertainty ranges of the ice sheets. In addition, we look at the high-end scenario, high-end sea level rise scenario, in order to capture the unlikely but not impossible case of a very fast and very high sea level rise. So this is what we get. As you see here, the sea level rise, coastal mean sea level rise over time, and the blue ones are the RCP 2.6s, and the purple one is the really high-end scenario. And as you see, we can end up with something like 25 centimeters or 30 centimeters in the very low cases, and the high-end scenario goes up to 1.7 meters of sea level rise in 2100 compared to nowadays. So this would be a huge thing. Sorry. A few short words to the methods we used. Our model, which is called the DIVA model, that does not appear here, fortunately. It works like this. We look at the coast and we look at a lot of data on coastal areas, and we cut the coastline into pieces wherever piece of the coast is very similar. in terms of biophysical and socioeconomic characteristics. So we end up with these pieces of the COACCH, which are of different of the coast, which are of different length, and globally we end up with about 12,000 of these segments, in average 70 kilometers long. The European Union has about 2,500 of these segments. For each of these segments, there is a model of the coastal plain behind. So, and this is quite simple. This is the coastal plain here, and you see we collect data about the population and the infrastructure which is in this coastal plain, and we also collect data on which elevation this population and infrastructure is located. And then we have data on extreme water levels. These are the H's here, and you see the very upper one is the H1000, which means this is the water level which is there once every thousand, which can be expected once every 1,000 years. And we look in our model explicitly at protection and adaptation. So what you see here, this gray thing is a protection measure, something like a dike or a seawall. And this holds back extreme water levels which are below the high of the thing. So in this example here, the H10 would not flood anything because it would be held back by the protection measure, and the H100 would flood the thing. And with this simple model, we are able to calculate something like expected damages, and that's what we have done also in COACCH in the coastal areas with a focus on European Union. And first thing to note is that the Europe is not the main contributor of global impacts on coastal areas. Here on the left, you see in the no adaptation case the global results, and here on the right the European results, and you see it's only a very small proportion of the global results, and the main contribution on the global accumulation comes from the South, Southeast, and East Asian coasts, where there are a lot of very flat lands with high population. Now we zoom into this European panel, and these are European results now. And very important takeaway message from the coastal areas is always that if we are successful in adapting, that means in raising the dikes as sea level rises, we can really lower the impacts by several orders of magnitude. So on the left hand, you see panels with results, protection costs on the upper one and sea flood costs on the lower ones. On the left, without adaptation, and there the assumption is we don't raise any dikes any more than the existing ones. So we freeze all dikes in 2015, and then the impacts, especially with high sea level rise scenarios, and especially towards the end of the century, get really, really huge. I have here one number. The Hurricane Sandy in 2012 in the US was about $70 billion. So without adaptation and a very high sea level rise, it could be like hundreds of Sandys each year at the end of the century only in Europe. However, if we are successful with adaptation here on the right hand, then you see it almost disappears. So impacts are several orders of magnitudes, at least 3 lower than if we do not adapt. And in the upper panel here, we see the adaptation costs would not be that high. They would be much smaller than the costs that we avoided damages. So if we look at country level results for the European Union again, we see, and that's also something which is in a way clear, the most affected countries are in Northwest Europe, so Belgium, Germany, France, the UK and the Netherlands, and Italy as the only Mediterranean country. And yeah, here you see again, with successful adaptation, we can lower these costs quite a bit. And if you look at the numbers here, you see that the adaptation costs are 2 orders of magnitudes below the potential damages. So adaptation really pays off. For COACCH, we at the first time looked at NUTS 2 level units, and this is a list of the most affected NUTS 2 level units. It's under the HCP 8.5, so sorted after these impacts, and in 2100 with no adaptation. So if somebody of you lives in one of these red or orange areas, don't panic, it's without adaptation. And we see again this local distribution. Interesting in the case of Italy is that in the case of Italy, most of the national impacts come from this northeast area, namely from the Veneto region. And I now show you a bit the coastal areas of the 3 most affected NUTS 2 units. So that's the Veneto region. The red one is the NUTS 2 unit, and the green to yellow one is the elevation of the coastal area, and the greener it is, the lower is the elevation. So dark green is 0 or below, and the yellow ones here are then 10 meters. And here in the middle is the city of Venice, and you see the whole administrative unit has a lot of low-lying areas, mainly rural areas, where it will be difficult to protect them on sufficient levels probably. And these are the 2, the second and the third one affected ones. These are in the UK, and you also see that it's mainly rural area with huge coastal plains and huge low-lying lands. Finally, we looked at land loss and coastal migration the first time, and these are results accumulated over the complete 21st century. And you see the highest migration numbers and the highest land loss is again in the countries where we also have the highest impact. So the Northwest European, North Sea coast kind of countries. And yeah, but also one of the conclusions is that coastal migration is also not a major problem probably in Europe. I mean, these are accumulated numbers, and even under the high sea level rise scenarios, we do not estimate more than 30,000 people in the single countries to migrate over the 21st century. This looks much worse in other parts of the world, again in Southeast Asia especially. Instead of conclusions, I have a little outlook what we do with these results. Next steps will be within the COACCH project to feed them into the economic models and to do economy-wide effects within European country and see how these coastal impacts contribute And we will also inform the assessment or the analysis of these socioeconomic tipping points. There will probably be other webinars looking at these results in the future, so stay tuned and you will get informed. And we also have a deliverable. I don't have it here, but if you go to the link Esther just presented, there will be a deliverable 2.3. This is the coastal impacts, which also has a part on river flooding, but the time was too short to present river flooding here. So I'm finished now and would hand over again to Paul.
Thank you ever so much, Daniel. So that is the two presentations. That's taken us across our initial hour slot. So that was important for us to sort of get the presentations through in the time period. We understand many of you are busy and so we'll drop off now. But for what we're going to do now, for those who have a little bit more time, is ask a few questions. There's one question that I can answer, which is, will the slides be available? Someone has asked after the webinar, and that's an easy yes. So the slides will be made available. We have about 200 people on this event, so we can't ask all the questions. So as moderator, I have to sort of pick a few, and I can pick them on the basis of who asked the first question, or the questions I like best, or just randomly. And I'll do a little bit of a combination of those. So what I will do is just ask a couple of questions first to our first speakers, and then they can respond. And then as the questions come in for Daniel, I'll ask him a couple more questions. And we'll probably do this for about 15 minutes for people who are still interested, but we will then pass all your questions over to the speakers as well. So we have a couple of questions now. So I'm going to start with two questions for Esther and one for Benjamin. So one question, and I'm not quite sure of protocol about whether I should say who these are from or not, but Esther, two questions for you. One is just around why the area of corn expands when yields decline, and our questioner has asked, wouldn't a profit maximizer produce and switch towards less sensitive crops? So to get a little bit more about the mechanism there. And then also, I think it would be great if you could say something about, on one of your slides, there was some losses shown for fisheries under RCP 8.5, but agriculture was for 4.5. And I suspect the answer to that is it's in the deliverable, but it would be good just to get a clarification on that. And then Benjamin, maybe I can ask you a question which is around the pre-harvest adaptation measures that you mentioned, and to get some more explanation on those. So if we take those three questions first, and then I'll see where we are after that in terms of timing and additional questions.
Okay, thanks very much. So first to the first question about the yield decline and area expansion. This is a result from the model that I showed in the economic impact assessment, so COACCH, and it's a partial equilibrium model, where I tried to very briefly tell you about the mechanisms of the model. So from the bottom up, you have then from the bottom up, you have then the change in the productivity, in this sense a decline in the yield. However, this is matched by various economic drivers, and these economic drivers are, for example, demand based on population growth or changes in diets. This means that whenever through this market interaction, you may have a decrease in the yield. However, this may mean that the price of the production of the product actually goes up, and therefore the agricultural losses are not as high as just the loss in productivity times a fixed price. So there is an optimization procedure where the new equilibrium between demand and supply has has to be found. And this leads to a change in the area allocation due to the increase in price, which is fueled by this increase in demand. That is actually like changing the area allocation up till the production, up till the extra unit of production is not profitable anymore, or not as profitable as indeed cultivating another crop. So there is a reallocation of area, but not enough to compensate the change in production. For the second question, with regard to the RCPs, yes, this is true that you can find more RCPs. So I had to make a selection, pre-selection in the presentation given the time. For agriculture and forestries, if you would look into the deliverable, you could see that it's done throughout the entire RCP matrix from 2.6 all the way through 8.5, whereas 4.5 is sort of like the benchmark RCP that we used in COACCH. The fisheries sector is a bit scientific, in the scientific literature, a bit less developed, I would say, than agriculture and forestries, and therefore we have to rely a lot about what has been currently estimated in the literature, and so far this has been 2.6 and 8.5. So it will give you sort of the range of the scenarios from which, for example, 4.5 could be interpolated, but it has not been estimated yet using biophysical models. I hope that answered the first two questions.
Okay,
yes, has Benjamin left already? Or I know Benjamin had to leave at some point. Benjamin, are you still there?
I'm still there. Can you hear me?
Yes, okay. So I've also been asked to tell people who the question was from. So that's fine, I can do that. The box tells me what the people's name is. It doesn't tell me how to pronounce them, so I may not pronounce your names very correctly. But Cecchini Patrana asked the question about what types of adaptation methods. Oh no, sorry, that's for the coastal one. This was for the what type of adaptation, pre-harvest adaptation measures are shown. That was from Antonio Grazie.
Okay, so answering the question, which type of pre-harvest adaptation measures were shown? Maybe the wording was not the best. It's not so much pre-harvest, but it's actually pre-seeding, so pre-planting adaptation. So this basically says that anticipating that there will be climate impacts, you already start growing a different crop. So, for example, you choose a different crop variety, or you choose a different also area that you will cultivate. So this is basically done just before seeding, and then you basically have two decisions of intensification. One is basically during the cultivation. How intensive do you cultivate it? What's the target yield? But on the other hand, there's also actually an anticipation that starts much earlier, which is in terms of crop breeding. So crop breeding usually takes something like 15 years in advance, and they are also, of course, they are looking at how will conditions change in the future, and then they are, for example, breeding more drought-resistant crops. And then the question is, right, how well will this anticipation happen? And if this anticipation works fine, then it's basically an adaptation to the crop climate impacts. Yeah, maybe that's as an answer.
Great. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move across to two questions for Daniel. So Daniel, the first question is, what type of adaptation methods are found to be effective in reducing coastal flooding? And that's from Cecchini Patrana. And then we also have a question from Eline Van Utrecht, which is, Belgium is amongst the most affected areas, but it has very low numbers for land loss and migration. And why is that? Have you got your microphone on, Daniel?
Yeah, here I am. Sorry, I was muted by the moderator, and then also the moderator can only unmute me, so I couldn't unmute myself. Yeah, thank you for the both questions, for the two questions. First one, what adaptation measures are found to be effective? It's clearly coastal protection by hard structural measures. That means dikes, seawalls, things like this. Other measures, adaptation measures we look at is nourishment, beach nourishment for erosion. So if your sandy coast erodes, the sand is washed away, you just put new sand on it. This is also done in large scales around the world, and this is also quite effective. But if it really comes to densely populated low-lying lands with high extreme water level events, then the most effective way to protect this are hard structural measures. There are also these nature-based solutions that you do something like dunes or so, but if you have really high populated low-lying lands, then there probably needs to be some hard structural measures and dike from things like concrete also as the core of an adaptation solution to such a system. The second question was about Belgium, and I did not really mention, because I was short of time, how this works in the modeling with the land loss and the migration. Land can only be lost, or people only migrate from land which is lost, and land can only be lost if it's not protected. So in a situation where you have a dike, then no land is lost as long as the dike is there. And especially in Belgium, we have a quite short coastline and a big coastal plain, which is densely populated with cities like Antwerpen and so on. So that means this will likely be protected. So that means we actually don't have any, I think, land loss and migration in Belgium. Nevertheless, we have impacts. If you have protection, there will be events at some points who overtop the existing protection, and then you still have impacts. But this is something, which you have to live with, at least in our model. And that means again that land loss and migration in our model basically appears in rural areas, and Belgium doesn't have so rural coastal areas.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. One of the things that we find on this is Daniel responding to one question triggers a whole set of other questions and other people chipping in. We can't really do this online on this function, but I think we will capture all of those issues, and I think we can always follow up with some questions. I'd like to just go to Esther now and ask a forestry question. So we had a question from Jorge Macho Azcarate, who was asking about the forest burned areas in Italy and how those are comparing to other parts of Southern Europe. And maybe you could say something about that for us.
Yes, thanks a lot. So actually, the spatial results I showed were related to the change in biomass and the change in harvestable wood for forestry, and for actually burned areas. They are I only showed European-wide results. However, it is true that there are differences across also the Mediterranean. And I will try if I can very quickly show you, if it's okay, you can see my screen now again. And sorry, this is a bit ad hoc, but this figure 13 here, it gives you the burned area in hectares. And this is actually a result of the FLAM model, so the biophysical model. There are two main factors here, and we would have to do some sensitivity analysis to see actually which one is driving the results of the differences in burned areas in Southern Europe. You could indeed see that, especially in Portugal, this is much higher than in other Southern European countries. There are basically two main drivers behind this. The one is the suppression coefficient, as they call it. And this suppression coefficient gives, for example, the population density, which in turn influences the amount of forest fires. And the second coefficients are those driven by climate variables, so regional differentiations in radiation, temperature changes, or precipitation, amongst others. I hope that explains a bit.
Yes, no, that does. Okay, I'm aware of the time now, and we have many questions, and I don't think it's possible to go through them all. What I think we should probably do is sort of we've been on now for 1 hour and 15 minutes. I would perhaps now suggest that we call it a day and you can't clap and thank our speakers, so I kind of have to do that. But I sort of take it on your behalf, that's okay. So what we will do is we will circulate the slides from this to the participants, and I'll investigate what exactly we do with the questions, but it's quite possible that we can put up some sort of generic replies or some specific replies to some of the questions that have been raised. And I think there's also an opportunity for you to connect with the individual researchers afterwards and probably also follow up with direct emails if there's areas of interest. So I think that's a fairly okay type of promise to make to you all. From my side, I would like to end by saying thank you enormously for joining us. We realize it's a really challenging time at the moment, and also thank you for giving up your time. I'd just maybe like to ask Francesco if you'd like to say anything just to close off for us. Francesco, I can see you coming on.
Yes, of course. So let me just join the thanks to our speakers, the chairman, and also all the participants. We are glad to see so much, so huge participation to this, to follow these themes in general, and in particular our coach, the coach work. Let me just remind that next May 14th, we are going to have the second webinar related to COACCH results, which is going to focus more on climate change impacts on labor productivity and energy production. So another topic that is quite, at least in our opinion, quite interesting. So with this said, I would like to thank you again, and I'm waiting for you at the next webinar. Bye bye. Thank you all.